Chapter 1 Eyes of Empire. The candles flicker against marble walls, casting dancing shadows that seem to write with a life of their own. Constantinople's great palace breathes in the darkness, its corridors filled with whispers and the distant echo of footsteps on ancient stone. The year is 1014, and somewhere in these sacred halls a man's fate is being sealed with words that will haunt an empire. General Nicephorus kneels before the throne, his armor removed, his dignity stripped away like discarded cloth. Behind him, his sons wait in chains, their young faces pale with terror. Before him sits Basil, the Emperor of the Romans, his eyes cold as winter stone. The general who once commanded armies, who once held the trust of the purple-born, now trembles like a child before judgment. You have betrayed our trust, the Emperor's voice cuts through the silence like a blade through silk. You have forgotten that loyalty to the throne is loyalty to God himself. The general's lips move in prayer, but no sound emerges. He knows what comes next. In Byzantium, there are punishments worse than death, fates that make the grave seem like a mercy. The emperor raises his hand, and the gesture carries the weight of divine authority. Behind him, the words hang in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. The executioner steps forward, his iron glowing red hot in the brazier's light. The general's scream pierces the palace walls, a sound that will echo through marble halls and into the nightmares of courtiers for generations to come. His sons watch as their father's world turns to eternal darkness, their own eyes wide with the knowledge that this is the empire they serve. This is Byzantium, where torture was not merely punishment, it was art, where mercy was not weakness, it was myth, where emperors claimed divine right not just to rule, but to reshape human flesh in the service of power. For over 1,000 years, this empire stood as the last bastion of Rome, the guardian of Christian civilization, the golden bridge between East and West. Yet beneath its sacred icons and holy ceremonies, beneath its claims of divine mandate, lay a darkness that would make devils weep. In these halls, where angels were painted on walls, men learned to become demons, where prayers echoed from chapel walls, screams rose from dungeon depths. This is the story of an empire that claimed to serve God while perfecting the art of breaking men. An empire where losing your sight was often considered an act of imperial mercy. But in Byzantium, losing your eyes was often a mercy compared to what came next. Chapter 2. The city of purple blood. Constantinople rises from the Bosphorus like a dream carved in stone and gold, its domes catching the morning light like captured stars. 7 hills cradle this new Rome, this good-guarded city that claimed to rule the world in Christ's name. Yet from its very foundation in 330 AD, this city was built on a lie that power and sanctity could coexist, that the throne of earthly empire could stand before the throne of heaven without casting a shadow. Emperor Constantine the Great chose this site not for its beauty, but for its position, the crossroads of the continents, the gateway between East and West. Here, he declared would rise a Christian empire that would last until the end of days. But Constantine could not have foreseen what his successors would make of his dream. He could not have imagined that his Christian empire would perfect tortures that would make pagan Rome seem gentle by comparison. The purple, that sacred color reserved for emperors alone, became stained with blood from the very beginning. Imperial succession in Byzantium was not a matter of law or custom, but of survival. Brothers murdered brothers, sons betrayed fathers, and mothers destroyed their own children for a throne that promised divine authority but delivered only human corruption. The crown was not inherited. It was seized, held by force, and defended with cruelty that knew no bounds. Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, earned his throne by outlasting 17 years of civil war, watching as pretenders rose and fell like wheat before the scythe. His hands were stained with the blood of family, his dreams haunted by the faces of those he had ordered killed. Yet when he finally claimed the purple, he ruled with the authority of God himself, his word becoming divine command, his anger becoming holy wrath. Justinian too, the man who would lose his nose and later wear a golden replacement, began his reign as a golden prince beloved by his people. But power in Byzantium was a poison that seeped into the soul, transforming saints into monsters and heroes into executioners. His court became a theatre of fear where nobles competed not in virtue, but in the artistry of their cruelty. And then there was Irene of Athens, beautiful, brilliant, and utterly without mercy. She rose to power as regent for her young son Constantine Vere, but regency was not enough. The taste of absolute authority was too sweet to surrender. When her son came of age and demanded his rightful throne, she made a choice that would define her legacy forever. On July 15, 797, she ordered her own child blinded and castrated, removing him from succession with iron and fire. The palace witnessed her son's screams echoing through the purple chambers where she had once sung lullabies. The woman who had given him life now took his sight, his manhood, his future. She stood before the throne, her hands unstained by blood but heavy with guilt, and declared herself emperor, not empress, but emperor, claiming for the first time in Roman history that a woman could wield the full authority of divine kingship. These were the rulers of Byzantium, each claiming to represent God on earth, while perfecting the art of human degradation. The palace became a maze of mirrors where saints and demons wore the same face, where the line between divine justice and satanic cruelty disappeared in shadows and screams. Courtiers learned to smile while their hearts pounded with terror, to praise their emperor's wisdom while planning his downfall, to serve God while serving the devil. The empire that claimed to be Christ's kingdom on earth had become something else entirely, a realm where power justified any atrocity, where the purple robes of authority were woven with threads of human suffering. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia's great dome, where thousands gathered to praise the Prince of Peace, emperors plotted tortures that would have impressed the most creative demons of hell. In a world where loyalty meant survival, even angels could become executioners. Chapter 3: Blinding the Betrayers. Rising tension. The art of blinding in Byzantium was not mere brutality, it was surgical precision applied to the architecture of power. In the empire's twisted logic, this punishment was almost merciful, a way to eliminate political rivals without the mortal sin of murder. The blinded could not rule, could not lead armies, could not inspire followers with their gaze. They became living ghosts, warnings to others who might dare challenge the purple throne. The technique was perfected over centuries of practice. The victim would be held down on a marble table, their head secured in iron restraints that bit into skull and jaw. The executioner, often a palace eunuch trained in this dark art, would heat twin rods of iron until they glowed like captured sunlight. The smell of heated metal would fill the chamber, mixing with incense and the victim's panicked breathing. Then came the moment of ultimate violation, the rods pressed against closed eyelids, the hiss of flesh meeting fire, the steam that rose like prayers to an indifferent heaven. Emperor Basil too elevated this practice to an art form during his Bulgarian campaigns. After crushing the army of Tsar Samuel at the Battle of Klydian in 1014, he faced 14,000 Bulgarian prisoners. Lesser rulers might have executed them or ransomed them back, but Basil understood the psychology of terror in ways that would have impressed Machiavelli centuries before that master of statecraft was born. He ordered every 100th man to lose only one eye, so they could guide their blinded comrades home. The remaining 13,860 were completely blinded. Their world turned to eternal darkness by imperial command. Imagine the sight that greeted Tsar Samuel when this procession of horror approached his capital, thousands of his bravest warriors stumbling in chains of human misery, led by the half-blind, their faces scarred and weeping, their future reduced to begging and memory. They say Tsar Samuel died of shock when he saw what his enemy had done to his army. But Basil felt no remorse. He had sent a message that echoed across the Balkans like thunder from an angry god. Challenge Byzantium and lose not just your life, but your ability to see the world you had tried to conquer. Justinian too, decades earlier, had learned the terrible lesson of blinding from the victim's perspective. When a coup led by Leontius removed him from power in 695, they cut off his nose and tongue before sending him into exile. But Justinian was a man who understood that even mutilation could not kill ambition. He learned to speak through his wounds, to command through his scars, to inspire loyalty even with a face that bore the marks of imperial justice. For 10 years, he plotted his return, gathering allies among the Bulgars and the Khazars, men who cared more about gold than about the aesthetics of leadership. When he finally reclaimed Constantinople in 705, his revenge was biblical in its scope and creativity. Leontius and his successor Tiberius III were not merely executed. They were made to kneel before Justinian's throne while he placed his feet on their necks, demonstrating his restoration of divine authority through the most humiliating of rituals. But the true horror of Byzantine blinding lay not in its immediate agony, but in its aftermath. The blinded existed in a twilight world between life and death, dependent on the charity of those who might once have been their subjects. Former generals became beggars. Former nobles became objects of pity and fear. They haunted the empire like living accusations, their empty sockets reflecting the moral blindness of the system that had created them. In the streets of Constantinople, children learned to recognize the shambling gait of the blinded, the way they held their heads tilted to catch sounds, the careful way they extended their hands to feel for obstacles. These men had once commanded armies, had once held the power of life and death over thousands. Now they commanded nothing but sympathy, and even that was often in short supply. The palace physicians became experts in the gradations of blindness, how much heat to apply for temporary blindness, how much for permanent damage, how to ensure the victim survived the procedure to serve as a living warning. They learned to distinguish between the screams of those who would recover their sight and those who would never again see sunlight or their children's faces or the pages of the holy books they had once read in their private chapels. But some who were blinded could still see the throne burning inside their minds. Chapter 4: The Golden Chains, Political Paranoia. The great palace of Constantinople became a prison dressed as paradise. Its golden walls reflecting not light but paranoia, its marble corridors echoing not with celebration but with conspiracy. Every smile concealed a plot, every bow hid a blade, every prayer whispered the name of a rival emperor. In this atmosphere of perpetual suspicion, torture evolved from punishment into prevention, a tool for rooting out treason before it could bloom into revolution. Empress Irene understood this truth better than most. Having seized power through the blinding of her own son, she knew that mercy was the luxury of those who had never tasted absolute authority. Her court became a maze of spies and informants, eunuchs who whispered secrets across silk pillows, servants who reported on their master's dreams. The empress sat at the center of this web like a beautiful spider, her intelligence network more effective than any army. The punishments she devised went beyond the crude brutality of earlier emperors. Irene was an artist of psychological destruction, understanding that the mind could be broken more completely than the body. Her victims were not simply tortured, they were erased, their identities stripped away layer by layer until nothing remained but fear and submission. Take the case of Constantine Sarantapicus, a general who had dared to question the empress's military policies. Rather than blind him outright, Irene ordered him confined to a monastery where he was forced to take holy orders. His head was shaved in the ritual tonsure, his secular clothes replaced with rough monastic robes. But this was not mercy, it was genius. A blinded general might inspire sympathy and secret support. A monk who had once been a general became an object of derision, his former authority neutered by holy vows that made him less than a man in the eyes of his former soldiers. The empress went further still. She commissioned for Sarantapicus a special mask of iron, fitted to his face with such precision that it could not be removed without keys that only she possessed. The mask had openings for breathing and eating, but none for speaking clearly. His words became mumbled and indistinct, transforming a once eloquent commander into a figure of grotesque comedy. When he appeared in the monastery's chapel for prayers, the other monks struggled not to laugh at the muffled sounds of his devotions. This was the true genius of Byzantine psychological torture. It did not merely punish treason, it made treason ridiculous. The mask served as both prison and theatre, transforming punishment into performance art that entertained the court while terrifying potential rebels. But Irene's masterpiece of cruelty remained the blinding of her son Constantine VI. The act took place in the purple chamber where he had been born, the same room where she had first held him as an infant and whispered promises of the great destiny that awaited him. Now she watched as palace eunuchs held down the young man who had once called her mother, their hands gentle but implacable as they positioned the heated rods. Constantine's screams were not the roars of a warrior or the curses of a defeated enemy. They were the cries of a child calling for a mother who would not come. Irene stood motionless as the iron seared away her son's sight, her face composed in an expression of imperial dignity that concealed the warfare raging in her soul. Later, court historians would debate whether she wept during the procedure, but none dared ask her directly. The psychological toll on the court was immediate and devastating. If an empress could blind her own child, what safety could anyone claim? Nobles began sleeping with guards outside their chambers, tasting their food for poison, examining their clothes for hidden blades. The palace filled with men and women who jumped at shadows, who saw conspiracies in every casual conversation, who trusted no one completely, not even themselves. The eunuchs, those sexless servants who formed the empire's administrative backbone, became masters of this paranoid atmosphere. Unable to father dynasties of their own, they invested their ambitions in the Byzantine intrigues of palace politics. They learned to read the empress's moods like weather patterns, adjusting their loyalty and betrayals to match the shifting winds of imperial favor. Some developed specialties in particular forms of torture. There was Stephanos, the keeper of secrets, who could extract confessions without leaving visible marks on his victims' bodies. His methods involved precise applications of heat and cold, the strategic placement of thin needles, the careful manipulation of pressure points that could induce agony without permanent damage. His torture chamber was appointed like a physician's study, with charts of human anatomy and shelves lined with precisely calibrated instruments. Others, like the eunuch Nicephorus the listener, specialized in psychological breakdown. He would place his victims in perfectly comfortable chambers, then subject them to constant, subtle stresses, lights that flickered at irregular intervals, sounds that came from no identifiable source, servants who appeared and disappeared without explanation. Within days, the strongest men would begin to doubt their own sanity, ready to confess to crimes they had never contemplated committing. When a mother blinds her child for the throne, the empire itself goes dark. Chapter 5 Flames of the Purple Throne beneath the great palace, in chambers that existed on no official plans. The empire perfected its art of sanctified cruelty. Here, in rooms carved from living rock and lined with marble that had been blessed by patriarchs, torture became liturgy, punishment became sacrament, and human suffering was transformed into an offering acceptable to the God of the Romans. The Byzantine understanding of torture was fundamentally theological. Unlike their pagan predecessors, who tortured for information or deterrence, Christian emperors believed that physical agony could purify the soul of treason. A rebel who confessed his crimes under torture was not merely defeated, he was redeemed. His treachery burned away by pain until only loyalty remained. This spiritual logic justified cruelties that would have made Nero himself recoil in horror. The punishment chambers were designed like chapels, with vaulted ceilings that carried screams upward like prayers. Golden icons gazed down from walls stained with blood and tears, their painted eyes witnessing agonies that tested the boundaries of human endurance. Incense burned constantly, its sweet smoke mingling with the acrid smell of heated iron and seared flesh. The torturers wore vestments like priests, their work elevated from mere brutality to holy service. Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, pioneered what came to be known as the Golden Punishment, torture conducted exclusively with precious metals, so that no base iron would defile the sacred act of correction. Victims were bound with chains of silver, their flesh seared with rods of gold, their bones broken with hammers cast from blessed bronze. The pain was identical to that inflicted by common metals, but the symbolism was everything. Even in agony, the emperor's enemies were reminded that they suffered by divine authority, that their pain was part of a cosmic order that placed the emperor just below God in the celestial hierarchy. The most feared of these golden tortures was the crown of Constantine, a circlet of gold fitted with inward-pointing spikes that were gradually tightened around the victim's skull. As the crown compressed, the spikes penetrated deeper, creating wounds that bled in rivulets down the victim's face like a grotesque parody of Christ's crown of thorns. The symbolism was deliberate and calculated. Those who challenged the emperor's authority were literally crowned with their rebellion, their treachery made visible in wounds that mirrored the savior's passion. But physical torture was only the beginning. The true artistry lay in the psychological refinements that accompanied the pain. Victims were forced to watch as their family members were brought into the torture chambers, not to be harmed, but to witness their patriarch's degradation. Children saw their fathers reduced to sobbing animals. Wives watched their husbands beg for mercy that would never come. The knowledge that their loved ones were observing their humiliation often broke proud men more completely than any physical agony. The Emperor Theophilos elevated this practice to its most sophisticated form during his persecution of the iconoclasts in the 840s. Those who refused to venerate holy images were not simply executed or imprisoned, they were tattooed with verses from scripture. The holy words burned into their flesh with heated needles that left permanent scars. The tattoos covered their faces and hands, making them instantly recognizable as condemned heretics wherever they went. But Theophilos' creativity reached its peak in his treatment of the monk Theophanes, who had dared to criticize the emperor's religious policies. Rather than kill the holy man outright, Theophilos ordered 12 verses from the Psalms tattooed across his forehead and cheeks. The words burned so deeply into his flesh that they would remain visible until death. The irony was exquisite. Theophanes, who had devoted his life to copying and preserving sacred texts, became himself a living manuscript. His face transformed into a blasphemous book that proclaimed his own condemnation. The monk survived the procedure, but was transformed into something between man and monument. When he attempted to celebrate the liturgy, the congregation would be distracted by the words writhing across his scarred features, the holy text made obscene by its context. His attempts to preach were undermined by the visual testimony of his rebellion branded permanently into his flesh. He became a walking contradiction, a holy man marked with holy words that proclaimed his unholy defiance. These public tortures served multiple purposes beyond the punishment of individual crimes. They were theater, carefully choreographed performances that reinforced the emperor's divine authority while entertaining a population hungry for spectacle. The crowds that gathered in the hippodrome to watch imperial justice dispensed were not merely witnessing executions, they were participating in religious ceremonies that reaffirmed the cosmic order with every scream, every plea for mercy, every moment of exquisite agony. The most elaborate of these spectacles was the trial of the throne, a ritual reserved for those who had actually claimed imperial authority. The pretender would be dressed in purple robes and seated on a throne of heated bronze, the metal gradually growing hotter until the fabric of his imperial costume began to smolder and his flesh began to cook. As he writhed in agony, unable to escape the throne that was consuming him, The crowd would chant hymns of thanksgiving for the emperor's victory over chaos and rebellion. But Byzantium's cruelty did not end with death. It continued in memory. Chapter 6: The Emperor's Mask. In the winter of 705, the people of Constantinople witnessed a sight that would haunt their dreams for generations: the return of a dead emperor. Justinian too entered his capital not as the Golden Prince who had once ruled from the throne of heaven, but as something far more terrible, a living monument to the empire's capacity for both cruelty and resurrection. The man who rode through the streets bore little resemblance to the Justinian who had been deposed 10 years earlier. Where once a proud nose had dominated his imperial features, now gleamed a prosthetic of pure gold, shaped by master craftsmen to approximate human flesh, at catching the winter light like a beacon of divine wrath. His tongue, partially severed during his deposition, gave his voice a distinctive lisp that transformed his words into something between human speech and the hissing of serpents. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as something beyond ordinary humanity. The gaze that had once been merely imperious was now absolutely merciless. The eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss of ultimate humiliation and emerged with his soul transformed into something harder than diamond, more cutting than steel. This was Justinian the Rhinometus, the slit-nosed, but he had become something far more dangerous than his epithet suggested. His decade in exile had not broken him. It had refined him into an instrument of perfect vengeance. Among the Bulgars and Khazars who had sheltered him, he had learned new forms of cruelty that would have shocked even his Byzantine predecessors. He had studied the art of delayed revenge, the psychology of systematic retribution, the way that hope could be used as effectively as despair to break the human spirit. The first act of his restoration was to summon Leontius and Tiberius III, the emperors who had ruled in his absence, to the throne room where they had once sat in judgment over him. But Justinian did not execute them immediately. Instead, he ordered them stripped of their imperial regalia piece by piece, each garment removed with ceremonial precision, while he watched from the throne they had stolen from him. When they stood naked before him, trembling with cold and terror, Justinian rose from his seat and walked slowly around them, examining their bodies like a connoisseur inspecting precious artifacts. He paused behind each man, placing his hands on their shoulders in a gesture that might have seemed paternal if not for the golden nose that caught the candlelight like a blade. "Kneel," he commanded, his damaged voice carrying absolute authority. As they dropped to their knees, Justinian placed his feet, still wearing the purple buskins that marked his imperial rank, on their necks, pressing their faces to the cold marble floor. For long minutes he stood thus, his weight bearing down on the men who had dared to claim his throne, while the court watched in absolute silence. This was not execution, it was liturgy, a ritual of restoration that placed the rightful emperor literally above those who had challenged his divine authority. But this symbolic victory was only the beginning. Justinian had learned patience during his exile, and patience made his revenge more exquisite than any immediate brutality could have been. He kept Leontius and Tiberius alive for months, parading them through the streets of Constantinople in chains, their former subjects jeering at the men who had briefly worn the purple. The psychological torture was masterful. They lived each day knowing that death was coming, but never knowing when or how. When he finally ordered their execution, Justinian demonstrated the full scope of his imagination. They were not simply beheaded or hanged. Instead, they were taken to the hippodrome and bound to stakes in the arena's center. But rather than face wild beasts or gladiators, they confronted something far more terrifying: Justinian himself, wearing the golden mask that had become his trademark, wielding an axe blessed by the patriarch. The crowd watched in fascinated horror as their restored emperor personally executed his predecessors, each blow of the axe accompanied by readings from scripture that transformed murder into martyrdom, vengeance into divine justice. The golden nose caught the arena's torchlight with each movement, creating the illusion that the emperor's face was constantly shifting between human and divine, mortal and eternal. But Justinian's appetite for revenge extended far beyond his immediate predecessors. He had maintained detailed records of every noble, every bureaucrat, every citizen who had celebrated his downfall or supported his rivals. Now he began working through this list with methodical precision, each punishment carefully calibrated to match the crime, each torture designed to serve as both retribution and warning. The Senator Callinicos, who had publicly praised Leontios, found his tongue removed with golden shears while his family watched from the gallery of the Senate House. The Patriarch Kairos, who had blessed Tiberius' coronation, was forced to perform his own defrocking ceremony, removing his vestments one by one while confessing his errors in a voice that grew weaker with each word. Most terrifying of all was Justinian's treatment of those who had merely remained silent during his exile. These men had committed no active treason, but their passivity was itself a crime in the emperor's twisted logic. They were subjected to the punishment of shadows locked in perfectly dark chambers where they could see nothing, hear nothing, touch nothing but smooth stone walls. After weeks of this sensory deprivation, they emerged as broken men who jumped at sudden sounds, who wept at bright lights, who could never again feel completely safe in any enclosed space. The emperor's golden nose became the symbol of his reign, a reminder visible in every court ceremony that the man who ruled them had survived the ultimate humiliation and emerged transformed. Court artists learned to incorporate the prosthetic into their portraits, making it seem like a divine attribute, rather than a mark of mutilation. The nose appeared on coins, in mosaics, in the illuminated manuscripts that chronicled the emperor's reign. Children born during Justinian's second reign grew up believing that all emperors wore golden noses, that this was simply how divine authority manifested itself in human form. The mutilation that was meant to destroy him had instead become the mark of his transcendence, proof that he had passed through suffering into a realm beyond ordinary human experience. Byzantium had no heroes, only survivors carved in gold and blood. Chapter 7: Empire of the Mutilated Aftermath. The legacy of imperial cruelty seeped into Byzantine society like poison into groundwater, contaminating every level of the empire's carefully ordered hierarchy. What began as political necessity in the palace became cultural norm in the provinces. The emperor's example licensing cruelty that rippled outward in waves of systematic brutality that would define the empire's character for centuries to come. In the theme of Anatolia, a provincial governor named Bardanes took inspiration from his emperor's golden nose to commission a workshop of imperial prosthetics. Here, skilled craftsmen created replacement features for the regime's victims: silver ears for those who had heard treasonous conversations, bronze tongues for those who had spoken seditious words, copper eyes for those who had witnessed forbidden sights. The workshop became a pilgrimage site of sorts, where the mutilated came seeking to restore some semblance of their former appearance. But these artificial features served a purpose beyond vanity. They marked their bearers as permanently diminished beings, former humans who had been transformed by imperial justice into something between man and statue. The weight of the metal prosthetics caused constant discomfort. Their unnatural appearance provoked stares and whispers, and their very existence proclaimed to all who saw them that the emperor's reach extended into every corner of his subjects' bodies and souls. The psychological effects on Byzantine society were profound and lasting. The generation grew up understanding that their physical integrity existed only at the emperor's sufferance, that their bodies were not their own but imperial property, that could be modified or destroyed according to the whims of divine authority. This knowledge produced a peculiar form of cultural paranoia. Citizens who examined their own reflections for signs of imperial displeasure, who felt their faces unconsciously when they passed the palace gates, who dreamed of waking up with golden noses or silver tongues. The empire's churches adapted their theology to accommodate this new reality. Sermons began to emphasize the temporary nature of physical beauty, the insignificance of bodily integrity compared to spiritual salvation. Icons appeared showing saints with obvious mutilations, missing eyes that had been plucked out for seeing heretical visions, severed hands that had written forbidden texts, branded faces that bore the marks of divine judgment. These images taught the faithful that suffering itself could be a form of sanctification, that imperial torture might actually serve as a shortcut to heaven. The Monastery of the Holy Resurrection, founded by a monk who had been blinded for criticizing the emperor's tax policies, became a refuge for the regime's victims. Here, the sightless learned new trades suited to their condition: weaving, music, the memorization of scripture. But even in this supposed sanctuary, the shadow of imperial authority loomed large. The monastery's charter explicitly forbade any criticism of the emperor's policies, and visiting officials regularly inspected the community for signs of seditious thought. Brother Theodore, the monastery's chronicler, developed a special script for recording the histories of the blinded brothers. His writings, preserved in manuscripts that survive to this day, provide chilling insights into the daily lives of those who had felt the emperor's wrath. They described the dreams that haunted the sightless, visions of the faces they could no longer see, memories of sunlight that grew dimmer with each passing year, phantom pains in eyes that no longer existed. But perhaps most disturbing were Theodore's accounts of the gratitude ceremonies that the monastery held each year on the anniversary of Justinian's restoration. The blinded monks would gather in the chapel to offer prayers of thanksgiving for the emperor who had taken their sight, expressing joy that their suffering had served to demonstrate the divine power that flowed through the imperial office. These ceremonies were genuine expressions of faith, not mere political theatre. The victims had been so thoroughly broken that they had come to embrace the ideology that justified their torture. In Constantinople's workshops, artisans developed new forms of decorative mutilation that transformed imperial punishment into fashion statement. Wealthy nobles began commissioning minor scarifications that mimicked the marks of imperial discipline, wearing artificial scars like jewelry that proclaimed their solidarity with the emperor's vision of justice. The most exclusive gatherings featured guests competing to display the most artistically pleasing wounds, turning the palace's torture chambers into inspiration for high society entertainment. The empire's legal system codified these practices into a comprehensive philosophy of corporeal punishment. The legal code distinguished between corrective mutilation, designed to improve the victim's spiritual condition, and exemplary mutilation, intended to educate observers about the consequences of resistance. Judges were trained to match punishments to crimes with mathematical precision, ensuring that each act of imperial justice contributed to the empire's overall pedagogical program. Children learned the gradations of imperial displeasure as naturally as they learned the alphabet. First-time offenders might lose only a finger or an earlobe. Repeat criminals faced the loss of hands or feet. Those guilty of serious crimes against the state lost eyes, noses, or tongues. The most dangerous enemies of the empire, those who had claimed imperial authority or threatened the dynasty's survival, faced the ultimate punishment of complete facial reconstruction. Their features obliterated and replaced with artificial alternatives that proclaimed their defeat to all who saw them. The empire's diplomatic corps adapted these practices for international relations. Ambassadors to foreign courts carried with them portable torture devices, crafted by the empire's finest metalworkers' instruments of such exquisite design that they served as both threats and gifts. Foreign rulers who received these presents understood immediately that they were being offered a choice between alliance and mutilation, cooperation and suffering. But some say Byzantium's ghosts never left, they just changed their crowns. Chapter 8 Reflections in the Dark, closing reflection in the fading light of a Constantinople sunset. The great palace stands empty, its corridors echoing not with the screams of the tortured, but with the whispers of tourists and the clicking of cameras. The marble floors that once ran red with the blood of emperors now gleam under electric lights, polished to a shine that reflects the faces of visitors who will never truly comprehend the horrors these walls once witnessed. But if you listen carefully in the silence between the tour guides' practiced recitations, you might hear something else, the ghost of an empire that never truly died, that merely transformed itself and learned to wear new masks. The tools have changed, but the hunger for absolute power remains constant, and the human capacity for rationalized cruelty continues to evolve with each passing generation. Today's emperors do not brand faces with heated iron, but they destroy reputations with surgical precision. They do not blind their enemies with glowing rods, but they blind entire populations to truth through the careful manipulation of information. The golden nose has been replaced by golden microphones, the purple throne by podiums bathed in television lights, the sacred incense of the torture chamber by the intoxicating smoke of power itself. Watch closely, and you will see Justinian's spirit walking through the corridors of modern authority. His mutilated face stares back from the screens where leaders speak of national security while ordering the erasure of dissenting voices. His golden prosthetic gleams in the artificial features of those who have sold their humanity for the promise of influence, who were masked of principle while serving only power. The blinded generals of Byzantium have become the discredited experts of our age, scientists silenced for speaking uncomfortable truths about climate change, economists destroyed for questioning unsustainable policies, journalists whose careers vanish overnight for investigating the wrong targets. They maintain their sight, but they are made invisible, their voices reduced to whispers in the margins while the machinery of power continues its ancient work. Irene's infanticide echoes in every system that devours its own children for the preservation of authority. The political dynasties that sacrifice their heirs to maintain control, the institutions that consume their most idealistic members to protect their corrupt cause, the movements that exile their founders when principle threatens profit. The empress who blinded her son to keep her throne would recognize the familiar patterns in boardrooms and government offices, where the future is regularly sacrificed to preserve the illusion of stability. The torture chambers beneath the palace have been replaced by rooms that look nothing like dungeons, corporate offices, where careers are murdered with paper trails, newsrooms, where truth is strangled by editorial policy, university departments, where intellectual courage is played out through the careful application of institutional pressure. The screens are quieter now, the blood invisible, but the essential cruelty remains unchanged. Even the empire's theological justifications for torture find their modern equivalents in the sophisticated rationales that transform obvious evil into apparent necessity. National security becomes the new divine mandate. Economic stability the contemporary version of cosmic order. The preservation of democracy the updated claim to sacred authority that justifies any atrocity committed in its name. The most chilling parallel lies not in the methods, but in the silence, the way entire populations can be trained to look away from obvious suffering, to rationalize the rationalization, to accept the unacceptable, because challenging authority requires a courage that most people discover they do not possess. The crowds that cheered in the hippodrome as rebels were tortured to death would recognize their spiritual descendants in every audience that applauds while dissidents are destroyed by more subtle, but equally effective means. Yet there is one crucial difference between the Byzantine Empire and our modern systems of power. The emperors of Constantinople never pretended to be anything other than what they were: absolute rulers whose authority derived from divine appointment and whose word was law. They were honest in their cruelty, transparent in their ruthlessness, open about their belief that power justified any action necessary to preserve it. Today's emperors are more sophisticated. They have learned to torture in the name of freedom, to blind in the service of enlightenment, to silence voices while claiming to protect speech. They have perfected the art of making victims complicit in their own destruction, of convincing the tortured that their suffering serves some greater good, of transforming obvious tyranny into apparent liberation. The golden mask that Justinian wore to hide his mutilation has become the ultimate symbol of power as relationship with truth. In our time, every institution wears such a mask, a carefully crafted public face that conceals the systematic cruelty necessary to maintain control. The mask is made not of gold but of rhetoric, not of metal, but of carefully constructed narratives that transform perpetrators into victims, torturers into healers, destroyers into saviors. But masks, no matter how skillfully crafted, eventually slip. The prosthetic nose eventually falls away, revealing the void beneath. The carefully constructed narratives eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The systems that claim to serve humanity as highest ideals eventually stand exposed as engines of destruction that serve only themselves. In Byzantium, they took your eyes so you'd never see the truth. In our world, they take the truth so we never open our eyes.